Σήμερα θα τιμήσουμε τον Franco Cecchi για την προσφορά του στον τομέα των μυοκαρδιοπαθειών και πιστέψτε με είναι πάρα πολύ μεγάλη. Ήταν πρωτοπόρος, είναι αυτός που ίδρυσε την Ιταλική Σχολή των Μυοκαρδιοπαθειών, το μεγαλύτερη ήταν στη Φλωρεντία. For Franco Cecchi. Franco Cecchi was the man who inspired me in the field of cardiomyopathies. This happened in 1999 at one of the most important workshops concerning cardiomyopathies at the House of Cardiology in the city of Sophia Antipolis, remember, Franco in Nice, France. Also in this seminar I met some other legends of cardiomyopathy. I remember Katie Schwartz has been passed away many years ago. She was a very close friend of you, Katie Schwartz. Franco is a friend of Greece. He has visited many parts of our country, also Mount Athos in past years, and especially our city, Saloniki, has been invited in our city many times in some conferences in the past. I think it's more than 10 conferences in Saloniki or in other places like Crete, if you remember Crete. To show how much Franco Cecchi loves Greece, I would like to tell you that in his first email address, he had as a logo the Greek island Kos. Remember, Franco, your first mail was Kos. I'm very happy and joyful that today the first cardiology department of Aristotle University Thessaloniki and the cardiomyopathy laboratory give this honor to Franco Cecchi for all his contribution in the field of cardiomyopathies. I would like to thank Franco.
Yes.
Now, Professor Vlachopoulos will read.
I have the difficult task to summarize what you have done.
Your CV, yes. And then Franco will give a talk about a tale, about a story in the field of cardiomyopathies, not a scientific talk, you mean, your personal history.
So I have the difficult task to summarize everything that you have done. So it's very difficult because you have such an extensive presence in the literature. But I will not take too much time of your lecture because we want to absorb it and want to enjoy it. So I would like to say that Professor Franco Cecchi is based in Florence. So Florence is not only the cradle of art, but also the cradle of cardiomyopathies, right? So I think this is very symbolic and this is very important. Professor Cecchi has been trained in Hammersmith, in St. George's, in NIH and Bethesda, right? I'm recollecting everything. And also he has been the teacher in various teaching sessions and training courses in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and in Fabry disease, in international bodies such as the European Society of Hypertension, of Cardiology. And of course, he has an extensive presence of original work in various papers. I think it's more than 150 papers. And so he's in the last years, in the last 5 years, and he's an exceptional thinker, not only because he has produced original work, but also he has shaped what we think, what we know, and how we act in the field of cardiomyopathies, syncope, Fabry disease, and sports cardiology. I think I have covered everything, and I don't want to take too much time, so I invite Professor Franco Cecchi to give us his personal tale. I'm not so privileged to have this personal relationship that you have with George, but I think I convey the appreciation of the whole medical community.
For your presentation, and thank you, Yorgos, because you made me think of the past, in fact. I usually, look at the future. But in this case, I had to go back and see at the past. It was very interesting. So let's start with what was my life. And this is the mantra of my life. Along the forks of a road, you meet other lives. To know them or not to know them, it's a choice that you make in a moment, which will guide you in your life. And that's what I'm gonna show you, because that's how I was started. I was a prominent football player, young football player. No. This is me when I was 16 years old, and I was bought by the Fiorentina team. You probably didn't know that, actually. And I had already played in the higher level of the teams. But what happened? This one. This was 1966. So terrible flood that destroyed most of the art in Florence, and it also destroyed all the houses that we had. I mean, me and our relatives. So we had a terrible time. We had during the winter, and that at that time it was really terrible. The winter was much worse than now. And
I remember the film Amici Miei.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So was it the same period? Okay.
Later. The movie of Amici Miei is about 10 years later, because you may see some of the images. However, I couldn't play at that time because it was impossible. We had no heating system. We were rearranged. Living in a couple of rooms. So I gave up. And actually, 2 years later, because I had to finish my degree, I was called and I was invited to join the national team for non-professional. And I said, no, I'm going to be a doctor. So that was one of the first choices I had to make. Second choice was to meet this man who was my chief and inspired me about cardiology. I was really puzzled between becoming a psychiatrist or a cardiologist. And actually, I decided to follow his instructions, start reading ECG at the age of 22, 21 years old. And he was rather good because he already published some papers. He was not a university man, he was a hospital man, but always with the idea of collecting data and then publishing them. And my thesis was left ventricular obstruction, including the first 3 patients diagnosed with what was called at that time idiopathic hypertrophic subaortic stenosis. That's how I got in touch with all the papers by Brownwald. So I tried to understand what it was really difficult to understand at that time. However, soon later, Dr. Dollara wanted me to start the Echo Lab. So I was one of the first to start the M-Mode Echo Lab in Florence. And a couple of years later, I won my position as a cardiologist at Careggi General Hospital. And at that time, it was the only big hospital in Tuscany. But what happened later was that, again, just by chance, there was no internet at that time. You may not remind, what was happening at that time. So I just had the chance to understand that there was a cardiomyopathy meeting, something very strange. And I convinced my chief of cardiology to go there. So we went by car to Budapest in 1979. And we met the guy that organized the meeting. He was a nuclear medicine guy, but very much interested in cardiomyopathies. And he gave me, a fundamental saying: meetings are for meeting. That means that you'll meet people, and there you make your choices. And the first choice was Professor Camerini. Professor Camerini, who had been trained at the Hammersmith in London in the late 50s, was a wonderful man, was a man that, it was the only place where they did myocardial biopsy, Trieste. Then I met John Goodwin. And I decided then to go for 1 month in London at the Hammersmith, and I also went to the National Heart and the Hospital for Sick Children, because at that time we had no pediatric cardiologist in Florence. And as I was doing the echo and I was running the echo lab, I was one of the few that could really detect congenital heart diseases, And so there at the Hospital for Children, I met a young man, was called Gaetano Tiene. Do you know what he was doing? He was actually pulling hearts from a basin, and he wanted to reinterpret the anomaly of these congenital heart diseases, okay? And so he was there, investigator for that, and he was directed by Bob Anderson, and they finally published a book over the congenital heart diseases, which were really not really well understood before. And then I went to the Hammersmith, and there was a young cardiologist, and it was Bill McKenna, and he taught me something which you wouldn't believe. To do what? Collecting charts. He had lots of charts with all the history of the patients that they had been seen 3 years before, 5 years before, and he tried to interpret the outcome of these patients. This had never been seen in Italy, at least in Florence. Nobody would do that. We only relied on anecdotal cases. So now we have 10 conferences each year, at least, important conferences. Now, you see, from 1979, we went to 1984. In 1984, there was another Lisbon International Meeting on Cardiomyopathies of all the experts from the NIH. And there was a big debate on evidence of true left ventricular outflow circumstruction, because at that time, obstruction was denied by many. So, not the importance of it, where it existed, okay? And then I met this young man who was Barry Maron, and we had a lot of fun together because he was a funny man, really liked joking. And then I decided to go to the NIH in Bethesda. And the outcome of that was 2 important papers. One about the long-term outcome of patients with that has survived the cardiac arrest, and then the other that the same man that has survived the cardiac arrest 15 years later went to heart failure. But then, I had another meeting. I met another person who was Paolo Camici, was working in Pisa at that time, and he studied the perfusion of the heart with PET. And in Pisa at that time, let me remind you that there was a big debate about whether ischemic heart disease, depending on obstruction of the coronary arteries, or dependent on your depression, mind, and everyone's functional. Because people, when they died because of myocardial sudden death due to ischemic heart disease, sometimes they couldn't find any thrombus in the artery. So we studied the first patients, with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and we found that, after dipyridamole, they couldn't raise their flow. So there was, the flow was blunted, and we described that in the American in JACC in 1991. But actually, the link of the things, comes to the fact that Maseri at that time had gone to Hammersmith, and he wanted Paolo to go there to study the perfusion of the hearts, following what they were investigating. So he moved to Hammersmith Hospital. But also there was a young doctor, whose name was Jacopo Livotto. He was from Florence. He had graduated and specialized as a neurologist. He was very unhappy. He didn't like neurology after all. So he went to London to understand what his future could be. And then before leaving London, just the last day, Paolo and Jacopo met. And Paolo suggested Jacopo to contact me when back to Florence. So Jacopo came to meet me in the summer. He got interested in cardiology and fascinated by hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So he started to work with me in cardiology. So you see that, how things really incredibly happen. And I managed to work together with Barry Meron and Jacopo, and this was the result. The result was to describe our patient population in Tuscany. And what the results were, that atrial fibrillation was an important component. At that time, I'm sorry that Bill is not here, the English group had written a paper where they said that atrial fibrillation had no importance in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. So we concluded saying our observation of relatively high prevalence of premature death to progressive heart failure in contrast to sudden cardiac death, because at that time everybody was just referring hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and sudden death, forgetting that there was heart failure. So, but Barry Meron was not happy, and let me remind an important point in HCM history. There was, after I had left at the NIH, a guy who was called Vananapazir was hired at the NIH and immediately started to implant pacemaker, claiming that in his idea, pacemaker implantation would really make a big difference in their outcome and in their life. And he published that paper. So Barry was absolutely outraged by that, 1994. And you see that in the range of patients that they reported in circulation, there was also an 11-year-old boy. I mean, amazing at that time. So in their paper, let me just read something that is also important for the mavacamten and the aficamten. Although most of the improvement of symptoms and hemodynamic indexes occur during the first few months of pacing, okay? And then at point 3, baseline pacing studies are not essential to identify patients who may benefit from pacing. And also additional therapy, for example, ablation of the AV node may be necessary. So this led for about at least 10 years to pacemaker implantation in these patients with absolutely no results. For 6 months, they felt improved, they felt better, a placebo effect. But then they had a lot of troubles out of that, including heart failure. But the most outrageous fact was that in 1995 at the ACCC meeting, I was there, and I heard that Vananapazir and Tripodi, Dorothy Tripodi was his girlfriend actually, they reported similar results in a children cohort, age 3, 5, 7. Amazing, that was really terrible. So we were both outraged, and Barry, succeeded in getting, you remember the Watergate? You remember the Watergate when Nixon had to stop being a president and to resign? Well, he got the Wall Street Journal involved. They did an investigation. They found that the deaths were not reported and complications were not reported. So there was a big scandal out of that. And Bill is very much aware of this because he was part of a commission that was going to investigate about that. But the sister of one girl that had been implanted with a pacemaker and that died suddenly, then they both decided to create this association to protect patients. And now this is the most important HCM association in the United States with over 15,000 associates. Meanwhile, we went on working, and we described one important risk factor, which is P wave greater than 140 milliseconds, and left atrial diameter greater than 50 millimeter is the back predictor of AF. So this is important because we all refer to LGE and MRI, but let's remember that we have simple elements to understand when there is an important risk factor. Then in 1999, I hired a biologist who started the genetic lab for HCM. I called and invited Hubert Segevis to perform the first alcohol ablation in the 3 patients, but of all, I was funded for the Italian HCM registry, where we collected in 3 years more than 1,600 patients from 40 Italian centers. And we, analyzing the data, we found that really, heart failure was more present than sudden cardiac death, but atrial fibrillation was one of the most important complications. And above all, we had coronary artery disease in the sense that the people had myocardial infarction and sometimes died out suddenly, but their coronary arteries were absolutely free of atherosclerosis. So we went back to trying to understand why this happened. Meanwhile, we started to organize a Florence meeting on cardiomyopathies. And by that time, Bill McKenna invited me to do this course, the course that Georgos mentioned before. And there I met this young guy, a young cardiologist, and his wife, who are here now, and invited me to give a lecture here in Thessaloniki. So the first lecture was 2001. And the man in the middle, by the way, was not a cardiologist, was a restaurant owner, I mean, where I ate the best fish I've ever eaten in my life, really. Now, Barry Maron was really in a good friendship with everybody, so he decided to write a paper, commenting about hypertrophic cardiomyopathy together with Bill McKenna, which never happened later after that. So we went on publishing papers, but the Maron had become 3. The one on the right is Bradley, who's now editor-in-chief of Circulation. And I didn't know, but he has 7 associate editors to work with him for the amount of papers they're going to have. And the other one is Marty, whom you probably understand. And they got involved in demonstrating that the obstruction was important, has an important factor for prognosis. So they were working together, and very often in our houses instead of the hospital, and these were results published in the New England. And at the same time, going back to the fact that we discovered that myocardial infarction and ischemic heart disease, without coronary artery disease, was an important complication of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, we reanalyzed our data that had been collected at the end of the 80s, demonstrating that they were an important component of the outcome. And this was really an important paper that we were really proud of at that time. But we also worked with the Mayo Clinic, and we demonstrated that myectomy prevented both heart failure and worse outcome and also sudden death, instead of just medical therapy. So this is a landmark paper which we are also proud of. And we also, as I showed before, we demonstrated that you had obstruction at the basal level at rest, but also it was important in 1/3 of the patient there was provocable obstruction. And here Marty reanalyzed all the data and all the papers and wrote this review about myocardial ischemia and hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Then one of the most important latest meeting was Magdi Yacoub. Magdi Yacoub came to Florence to give a lecture in a meeting. I met him and I asked him, "Are you leaving tonight?" And he said, "No, I'm leaving tomorrow afternoon." So I said, "Why don't you come with me to the Chianti area where I have to go and collect some, big flask of wine, this 50 liters wine, because I was bottling myself." I said, "Okay, I'll come with you." And it was an incredible meeting, because during the day after buying the wine, we made a deal. I said, "Look, I'm not happy with the alcohol ablation in our patients because 1/3, didn't work, and 1/3 they had to be reoperated." And so I said, "Look, we need to have somebody that can train our surgeons." And they said, "Okay, we'll do it. But please come to Egypt because I want to leave my legacy to Egypt, and I want you to help me in raising something about including cardiomyopathies." So what happened is that he successfully operated 70 patients, 11 of whom with mid-ventricular obstruction and apical aneurysm, and we trained Egyptian cardiologists in HCM management, genetic studies, above all coronary angioplasty during myocardial infarction. So we helped him to develop the Aswan Heart Center between 2005 and 2011. And here are the meetings in Florence and this was the first time that he operated patient in the Aswan Heart Center. And as you can see now, they did 1,100 open heart operation. 2,800 cardiac catheterization, and they have, a lot of patients, and it's really a marvelous institution. We went on creating our international meetings, and as far as I remember, George was usually came to see us, and here we are all together. And these are the papers that we published with MonAsty. The MonAsty, one of the questions was, why do we have areas where the hypertrophy is located? And it's so different in family members, and why does this happen? And he offered a good explanation for that, which we were not thinking about. And also we established the stages of hypertrophic cardiomyopathy I showed before. Barry Maron established the summit, the international summit, and we always were invited to that. And with Perry Elliott and Bill McKenna, we participated in the writing both the classification paper and the guidelines in 2014. But the last meeting was meeting Nicola Maurizi, who's now head of cardiomyopathy unit at University of Lausanne. And with him, we worked with the demonstrating, and there were some doubts about that subcutaneous ICD were efficacious in stopping ventricular fibrillation in patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. And this happened in all patients that we studied, except one who was really very obese. So, and then Paolo Ferrazzi, heart surgeon in Monza and Bergamo, who had to establish a connection because Magdi Yacoub at the age of 73 was not allowed to operate anymore in our hospital. So we demonstrated with him that when you operate patients with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and obstruction, 1.3% and 2.4% of males had a Fabry disease, and that Fabry disease was a little bit more common in these patients. But the last project that I succeeded in creating was to create this association of cardiomyopathies. We founded in 2019, and in 2023, the guidelines on cardiomyopathy management found that one of the pillars was the patient support, which we had already created in 2019. And I want to show this because I believe that it's one of the best really project that we have ever done, with our patient and our colleagues. We now have a listening hearts hotline where people can talk, and just in 2024, we helped more than 200 patients, and this year we have already reached more than 300. So people are helped by this. And we also do courses for patients and relatives in the idea that the shared decision-making is an important point. We wrote a book with 20 stories of women and men facing the challenge of cardiomyopathy, and out of the book, we created a documentary movie on how to live with a cardiomyopathy, which you can find. I mentioned before that we described a step-by-step approach to ICD or not to ICD, which is very important for the patient, that I would really be happy if you want to receive that topic and translate it in Greek. But if I may say, are we always so serious, so busy with cardiology? We never laugh, we never joke. And let me watch this. Let me show this. You may recognize somebody. This is Aris. I don't know why it doesn't start. This is Aris. This is me. This, I believe, is Adelena and Perry. And behind there is Aris. And here, if it starts, hopefully you will enjoy, but I doubt. You know who's that lady with the hat? Perry distributing alcohol and wine. Aris again. The one with the head is Arbustini, Eloisa. whom you have invited several times here, by the way. And Alida as well. So, lots of fun, not only work and not only debates. Okay, I have the last slide, but I cannot proceed. If you can help me, can you put me the last slide, please? Okay. So, at last, what I can say about my scientific life, that it's been a long, exciting, and fascinating journey so far. But let me quote Benjamin Disraeli, which says that the secret to success is constancy of purpose and to be ready for his opportunity when it comes. And that's what I did. So this is the actual Florence trio: Jacopo Levotto, Maurizio Peroni, who's an expert of inflammatory heart disease, me, and hopefully Niccolo Maurizio will join us and will replace me at the Hospital of Florence. Thank you very much.
Can you read what we have right here?
Yes. From the first University Clinic of Cardiology and the University Hospital of Aristotle University, I guess. This is an honorary riconoscimento onorario, honorary understanding that Professor Franco Cecchi has given a significant contribution to cardiology and to all patients that had a cardiomyopathy. Thank you.
May I say a personal, I would like to draw an analogy to make a metaphor, because you showed the flooding in Florence in 1966. A few years back when I was in Florence, I saw and I noticed that there was a mark in some of the buildings that showed up the height up to 1 meter above in coming from this flooding. And I remember that because it was the year that I was born. So this is why I make this this recollection. So I would like to make an analogy through a metaphor that in 1966 there was this flooding, but you flooded the world with knowledge, and this is the greatest reward that someone would take in his lifetime. We appreciate what you have done.
Thank you.
Κατάλληλο άνθρωπο, αλλά επιλέξαμε και τον κατάλληλο πρόεδρο. Συμφωνείτε, κύριε Πρόεδρε? Λοιπόν, αρκετά σας κουράσαμε. Νομίζω ότι ήταν μια καλή συνάντηση. Είπαμε καινούργια πράγματα. Ήταν εξαιρετικοί οι ομιλητές. Οι πρόεδροι ήταν πάρα πολλοί, κράτησαν τα τραπέζια σε υψηλό επίπεδο. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ που βρεθήκατε εδώ.
Εμείς ευχαριστούμε.